My name is Jacob. This is my prospectus, my thesis presentation, and I guess I'll just get right into it. The title is Disabling Charlotte Smith, a Marxist, Crip Theory Analysis of Gender, Class, Labor, and Disability in Romantic Poetry. Okay, so project overview. I'm going to be covering three authors mainly. It's going to be William Wordsworth, Charlotte Smith, and Robert Bloomfield. And my goal is kind of to make Wordsworth and Bloomfield the framing pieces of this project. So taking Wordsworth and looking at how Wordsworth writes about labor and class, and taking Bloomfield and seeing how Bloomfield writes about labor and class, and comparing the way that those are different to how Charlotte Smith writes about labor and class, and also her position as a woman, and how kind of all three of these results for her in what I say should be considered disability. Okay. Oh yeah, and then the key frameworks I'm using are Crip theory, it's kind of a disability studies framework, which is right here, and Marxism. So start off with Crip theory and normativity. This is going to be like the disability studies framework of my project, and I'm really interested kind of in like, what do we expect out of bodies in general? Like, what can a normal body be expected to do, and how do disabled bodies fit into this narrative, fit into these expectations? And so kind of what I'm looking at with this in conjunction with Marx is like, what are bodies expected to do under capitalism, and how are these expectations harmful over time, you know, when, especially to labor and class people, how are these expectations of the amount of labor someone can do in a certain time period very harmful? And yeah, so then I'm just going to be incorporating a lot of disability studies analyses of like normativity, and a general disability studies intro, because I know it's kind of a new field. And then my main disability studies framework that I'm going to be using is Crip theory. It was kind of introduced not too long ago, it's like 10-15 years, but then there's this really big book by Alison Kafer, Feminist Queer Crip, that I really enjoy, and basically Kafer argues in favor of including folks, this is a quote, including folks who identify as or with disabled people, but don't themselves have a disability in this conversation of disability studies and in this conversation of disability. And so we're kind of arguing for the necessity of including within disability communities those who lack a proper diagnosis, so that's like medically accepted, doctor provided, insurance accepted diagnosis for their symptoms. And I think that this framework is especially important for Charlotte Smith, because when we look at Smith's labor and we look at the effects of this labor on her body, it's clear that she really she is going through a lot of things. She has a lot of, pain that she'll write about, suffering, melancholy, fatigue, but all of these, we wouldn't go back and say oh, she had this specific condition, she had this specific disability, because we don't know too much about these, exactly the specifics of these conditions. So yeah, I think that's going to be a really important framework. Yeah, that's basically what I said. And then looking at how intense, repetitive physical and emotional labor take a toll on her body over time. So kind of tying it back into these expectations of bodies, how much can we expect out of one person's body? So moving on. Okay, and then one of my fundamental pieces of this Marxist analysis, of course, is going to be Capital, Volume 1. And there's a quote that I really liked from this, where Marx argues that the working day does have a maximum limit. It cannot be prolonged beyond a certain point. Within the 24 hours of the natural day, a man can only expend a certain quality of his vital force. He must rest, sleep, and then during another part of the day, he has to satisfy other physical needs, to feed, wash, and clothe himself. And then really importantly, it says the worker needs time in which to satisfy his intellectual and social requirements. So in comparing this with Charlotte Smith, and something I'll go into a little bit later, is we see Smith as someone who does not have the time, or she's expected to work more than this maximum limit, right? Because she both performs the physical labor of writing to provide for her family, but then at the end of the day, as a single mother for much of her life with 12 children, she turns around and she has to immediately perform an immense amount of emotional labor to provide for her 12 children. So there's no break. There's no time where she can rest and take time for herself, and over a long period of time, this has a huge impact on her body. And so she's just she's a lot of the time deprived of these things that Marx argues are necessary for survival, like rest and sleep. And then, additionally, another thing I wanted to bring up about Marx is that he acknowledges the effect that labor has on the body and mind. And this is going to be really important to my disability studies framework. And so Marx argues that labor is, first of all, a process between man and nature, a process by which man sets in motion the natural forces which belong to his own body, his arms, his legs, head, and hands, in order to appropriate the materials of nature in a form adapted to his own needs. So this is really important. It's just showing that there's a relationship between labor and the body. And then going on, Marx argues that through this movement, he acts upon external nature and changes it, and in this way, he simultaneously changes his own nature. So going on, looking at Charlotte Smith, this analysis is gonna look at the way that Charlotte Smith engages with her physical and emotional labor and how those types of labor impact her body over time. Okay, and so I kind of just wanted to lay out this framework that I'm going to use for analyzing, or this kind of progression of how class, gender, labor, and disability work together. So I basically argue that the class and gender position of workers, so say someone like Charlotte Smith, determine the type of work that she has to perform. So for Smith, this is her class and her gender position. Her class position makes it so that she is not upper class. She was kind of born middle class, but then she's abandoned by her husband. He's in prison, debtor's prison, on and off. So she's in a spot where one of the only things that she can do is to write for survival, because she also needs to be there to provide for her children a lot of the time. So because of her class position, because of her gender position, and she's expected to perform the emotional labor of taking care of her children, she is required to perform this labor for survival and repetitively every day. Whereas someone like Wordsworth, might be like, oh, I don't need to work that hard because I'm coming from a class position where my labor, if I just am feeling tired one day, if I don't have the energy, things like that, it's not a question of survival, whether or not he can perform the labor. And then so this repetitive labor over time can often result in impaired and disabled bodies. So this is kind of my argument that Smith over time, undergoes this process of being disabled by her labor. And then also by the expectations of getting back into the workforce and things like that. Alright, and here's my thesis. So my thesis is basically that Charlotte Smith was writing about her experiences of impairment and disability through her poetry, and specifically about disability and its relation to her gender, class, and labor positions. And Smith's gender and class positions become direct determinants of the type of labor she has to perform, so both physical and emotional labor. And then within that, the type of physical labor, it's not like agricultural labor, it's not factory labor, it's specifically writing poetry and writing novels. And therefore, continuing on that, Smith resists normative conceptions about what labor and disability should look like while she is simultaneously engaged in a system that consistently forces her to re-engage with demanding physical and emotional labor. And then finally, we see this in the way that Smith uses her poetry as a medium through which she can display and express the way she goes through this often disabling process. And then, so one of the big things that I'm going to talk about, I've already touched on a little bit, are kind of these relationships between class, gender, and labor. And so basically replically who occupy this laboring working class position, they're often forced to perform repetitive, draining labor with very long hours. And at the same time, laboring class women are also expected to take care of their families, adding to the amount of labor they need to perform on a daily basis. So this work labor is added to the emotional labor that is often not recognized as labor and work in the traditional sense of what is work. So that's part of kind of resisting this normative idea of what constitutes work and valid work. And then over time, the workers who are placed in this position of having to perform repetitive labor because of their class position and performing constant emotional labor because of their gender positions often experience tremendous impacts on their physical and emotional health, showing how gender and class are direct determinants of labor, which determines disability over time. So some stuff that I've already gone over, but I think that's like kind of the main argument of my paper, is that there's this process that they go through. And yeah. Okay, so moving on. Okay, so first piece of framing Charlotte Smith is Wordsworth, of course, and the specific poem that I'm going to be using to do this is Simon Lee from his Lyrical Ballads. So I'm arguing that Wordsworth Simon Lee does provide an example of a poet writing about like a laboring class character, but he's doing it in an inauthentic way. And this is because his gender and class positions don't directly determine his labor in the same way, which is something that I've gone over. But so in this way, he's very much separated from his character, and Simon Lee, you know, is like a laborer. He like performs labor outside, he hunts, he does all these things, and then in the position we see him in the poem, he's performing another act of physical labor. So, you know, Wordsworth is very far removed from this, and therefore, and in the lines of the poem, we can see him writing about it more as a spectator than someone actually performing this, which we do see in Charlotte Smith's work. And then Leo, like Smith, was occupying this laboring class position, and I'm going to be looking at his Farmer's Boy poem, which is kind of like his main work that people remember him for a lot of the time now. For the large part, this poem kind of describes the experience of repetitive farm labor, but it takes on a much more cheerful tone than Smith's writing does, showing kind of again like, even though he is in the laboring class, that he's not writing his own personal experiences into it quite as much, because the main character in the Farmer's Boy is going through these, but describing it like, oh wow, it's so nice, like I'm out here, like, you know, planting seeds again, and oh look at this cow, like let me clean up after it, but you know, like, it's not really too worried about the effects on his body in this poem. Okay, so then going into Charlotte Smith, this is where like the bulk of the work I'm going to be covering is. I'm going to be including a lot of her sonnets, also The Emigrants and Beachy Head, which are two of her big poems. And so she's kind of the example of a poet whose gender and class positions determine labor, which then results in disability. And one of the most important things about Smith is that she writes her life experiences into her poetry very vividly. And you can, there are a lot of links between things that she's dealing with at the time, whether it's like her husband being in debtor's prison, or struggling to pay bills, or fighting, you know, having legal issues, or just, you know, it being really hard to keep writing and writing and writing all of this work. She writes that very vividly in her poetry. And so in this way, I argue that her speakers are demonstrating this same process that she is going through in real life. So some examples. So back to Charlotte Smith, Sonnet 22. Basically, she introduces this sonnet by talking about, like, kind of setting herself up in a state of solitude. So she says, "O solitude, to thy sequestered vale I come to hide my sorrow and my tears, and to thy echoes tell the mournful tale which I scarce trust pitying to friendship's ears." And so, you know, introducing it here, we see that she's in this state of solitude and sorrow, and this solitude eventually, by the end of the sonnet, shifts into despair and pain, which you can see here. You know, she's talking about a story of despair and pain, and it's inescapable. So at the end she says, that fate assists me to endure and bear a while what death alone can cure. And you know, not to go into it too much, but in this sonnet we see a progression from her being in a state of solitude to her describing how this state of solitude is something that only death can help her escape from. And so following this process, the sonnet kind of begins by introducing a condition, the state of solitude, and then this condition progresses. So as this condition continues, as Smith is And paralleling her own life as Smith is forced to perform like repetitive physical and emotional labor, the way she writes about her experiences of pain, suffering, melancholy, etc. intensify. So yeah, this is prevalent in this shift from the start of the sonnet to the end of the sonnet. And in writing this line, Smith also exemplifies this inescapability of her position. Not just her position and state of solitude, but also since she has such a close connection in her writing to her own lived experiences, she's talking about this position of labor, of performing physical and emotional labor, of being stuck in debt, of being in a spot where she has to care for her children every day, and she is worried about her husband being in prison, and she's just trying to provide food for her children, and it kind of just shows how she really can only see like one way out of it. And then, yeah, let's see, moving on to the next sonnet. Okay, sonnet 21, the sonnet before this, talks a lot more, instead of the progression of a condition, kind of about repetition, and the repetition of things like her labor. So she writes, I hurry forward, passion's helpless slave, and scorning reason's mild and sober light, pursue the path that leads me to the grave. So this is kind of representative of the labor that she has to perform, right? She's hurrying forward, she's always stressed about what she has to do, how much labor she has to perform to provide for her family, but she's also feeling like she can't get out of it, kind of mirroring the last sonnet where there's like no way to escape from this position. And and then at the same time, she's acknowledging the effects that this labor has on her body. So she's pursuing this path that leads her to the grave, to death, and then she kind of writes, she compares her own experience to that of an insect flying around a flame. So it's kind of just like her flying around this thing, that she's kind of like stuck to over and over and over again until she dies, until her body can take it no more. And so yeah, the effect of the body on the body is exemplified by this insect flying around until it dies, and it kind of mimics this sentiment not only seen in her other works, but seen generally throughout her life, of this repetition until some end, which is oftentimes death. And then connecting this to the Emigrants, the introduction to the Emigrants, Smith writes that the following performance is far from aspiring to be considered as an imitation of your inimitable poem, The Task. I'm perfectly sensible that it belongs not to a feeble and feminine hand to draw the bow of Ulysses. So she's writing to Cowper here, and she's basically positioning herself as, like, setting herself up as saying, like, oh, I am already below you, both because of my gender position with the reference to the feminine hand, but also because, when she says feeble, and this is a term that's used a lot in disability studies and has been used a lot negatively historically, when she writes this, she's kind of like alluding to the effects on her body and how, her hands, after doing so much writing for so long, are kind of like weakened. They're in pain. So yeah, and that's, she writes a lot about her hands being like cramped, deformed, and swollen, things like that. So we can definitely see these effects of her labor on her body over time. Yeah. And then, yeah, that's it. Going